What happens when two cops harass an elderly black woman, only to realize her son is the U.S. Attorney General? The grocery bags in the passenger seat rustled softly as Evelyn Matthews pulled onto Brentwood Drive, a quiet street lined with well-kept lawns and large two-story homes. She had lived in Lexington, Kentucky, for over 20 years, and this was just another Thursday afternoon, until it wasn't. She first saw them in her rearview mirror, a black and white police cruiser trailing her car. Its presence was just enough to stir something deep inside her. At first, she dismissed it. Maybe they were just patrolling. Maybe they weren't even paying attention to her. But then the flash of red and blue lit up behind her, and her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. She wasn't speeding, hadn't run a stop sign, and wasn't doing anything wrong. Still, she signaled, pulled over to the curb, and put the car in park. Her heart wasn't racing, but a familiar tension settled in her chest, a tension she'd known all too well. Having grown up in a world where people like her had to be twice as careful. She exhaled and reached for her purse, where her license and registration were tucked away. But before she could grab them, a sharp knock at her window made her pause. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting the reflective sunglasses of the officer standing outside her door. Another officer stood behind her car, his hand resting near his holster. In a clipped, impatient tone, the first officer said, with no greeting, no explanation, "License and registration." Evelyn kept her movements slow and deliberate. She knew the rules, hands visible. No sudden gestures, nothing that could be misinterpreted. She rolled down the window. "Good afternoon, officers," she said evenly. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The officer shifted his weight. "Your vehicle matches the description of a stolen car. We need to see your ID." Evelyn's eyebrows lifted slightly. A stolen car, a silver sedan, the same one she'd been driving for nearly a decade. Still, she didn't argue. She reached into her purse, retrieved her license and registration, and handed them over. The officer snatched the documents with barely a glance before walking back toward his cruiser. The second officer lingered. He peered into the back seat, scanning the bags of groceries and the neatly folded reusable shopping totes. He didn't say a word, but Evelyn could feel the weight of his gaze. She knew what he was thinking, she knew the assumptions running through his mind, but she stayed calm because this wasn't new yet. Something about today felt different. Evelyn sat still, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the officer in the side mirror as he returned to his cruiser with her ID. The second officer still hadn't moved. He stood just outside her backseat window, his eyes scanning every inch of her car as if expecting something to magically appear. His fingers drummed lightly against his belt. He wasn't talking, just watching, refusing to let her posture falter. Evelyn asked in a smooth yet firm tone, "Is there a problem, officer?" The man didn't answer right away. He took his time, his eyes flicking to her hands and then back to her face before finally speaking. "Where are you coming from?" She tilted her head slightly. The question wasn't necessary. Not for a routine traffic stop. Not if they already had her license and registration, but she answered anyway. "Grocery store, just picking up a few things before heading home." He nodded. But the way he did it suggested he didn't believe her. "You live around here?" Evelyn's fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel. "I do," she replied after a slow breath. "Officer, is this relevant to why I was pulled over?" That line seemed to unsettle him. His stance shifted. He squared his shoulders just a little more. "We're just making sure everything checks out," he said. Evelyn had heard those words before. She knew what they really meant, long before she could respond. The first officer returned her ID, still in his hand, but this time his expression was different, a little harder, a little more suspicious. "This car isn't coming back as stolen," he admitted, "but we still need to verify a few things." The second officer moved closer, his hand now hovering a bit too near his holster as he ordered, "Step out of the vehicle." "Ma'am." Evelyn arched a brow. "Is there a reason I need to step out of my vehicle?" she asked. Her voice measured and controlled. The first officer didn't like that. His jaw clenched as he replied, "Ma'am, we're asking you to step out." We don't need to explain ourselves. But that wasn't true, and Evelyn knew it. She had spent over 4 decades teaching children how to think critically, how to ask questions, and how to stand their ground when they knew they were right. She had taught these men's own children, and now they expected her to ignore everything she'd spent a lifetime instilling in others. She exhaled slowly and reached for the door handle. The moment she unlatched it, the second officer stepped back, his hands still hovering near his holster as if he expected her to do something. She swung the door open, moved deliberately slowly, and planted both feet on the pavement. The air was thick and tense. The first officer folded his arms. "You got any weapons on you?" he asked. Evelyn blinked. She was wearing a loose, short-sleeved cardigan over a simple blouse and slacks. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was armed. Yet they were treating her like a threat. "I don't," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of something heavier now, something borderline indignant. The first officer gave a short nod, then tilted his chin toward the trunk. "Mind if we take a look inside?" There it was. Evelyn locked eyes with him. "Do you have probable cause?" The second officer shifted uncomfortably, while the first officer held his ground. "We're just making sure everything checks out." "That phrase again," Evelyn murmured, inhaling sharply through her nose before smiling. It wasn't a warm smile. It wasn't polite. It was the kind of smile that said, "I see exactly what you're doing, and I'm not playing along." Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out her phone. Slowly and intentionally, her thumb moved over the screen as she scrolled through her recent calls. Then tapped her own name. She lifted the phone to her ear, waited a few seconds, then spoke. "Hey, baby, I'm fine, but these officers here seem to think I'm a car thief." The shift was instant. The first officer's face twitched, a flicker of hesitation, confusion, concern, while the second officer glanced between them, suddenly uncertain. Then Evelyn dropped the bomb. "Oh, I'll hand in the phone. The U.S. Attorney General would like to speak with them." The first officer blinked. The second officer took a half-step back for the first time since this encounter began. They looked unsure, and in that moment, Evelyn knew she had him. The only sound was the faint buzz of distant traffic and the wind rustling through the trees. Neither officer moved. Evelyn extended the phone toward them, her grip steady. "Go ahead," she said, her voice light but full of meaning. The first officer hesitated, his jaw tightened. But his fingers. The second officer didn't move. He exchanged a glance with his partner, shifting from foot to foot as if he were suddenly unsure of his place in all of this. "You don't want to take the call?" Evelyn asked, her eyebrows rising slightly in the silence. Then, a tiny but commanding voice echoed through the speaker. "Mom, what's going on? Put me on speaker." And just like that, the balance of power tilted. Evelyn turned the phone so that both officers could hear. "You're on," she said calmly. On the other end, however, the voice was not so calm. "This is us. Attorney General Richard Matthews speaking." "To whom am I speaking?" The second officer took another step back. The first officer's face lost its edge, and his stance shifted just slightly, enough for EVN to notice the change in demeanor. "Sir, this is Officer Dawson with the Lexington PD." "I see. Now tell me." "Officer Dawson, why are you detaining my mother?" Dawson opened his mouth and then shut it. Up until now, the second officer had remained silent. Suddenly, he found something interesting to examine on the ground. Evelyn watched as realization sank into their expressions. They weren't dealing with just anyone. They had stopped a black, elderly woman for no valid reason, and now they had to answer for it. "Sir." Dawson cleared his throat. "We were conducting a routine stop." "A routine stop?" Richard's voice cut in sharply. "You forced a 72-year-old woman out of her car. You asked to search her vehicle without probable cause. That's not routine now, either." Neither officer had an answer for that. And Evelyn just waited. She already knew how this would play out. They would backtrack, as they always did. Officer Dawson cleared his throat again, his confidence draining with every second of silence. "We may have overstepped," he said finally, though his words sounded forced. Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She had taught middle school boys with more conviction than this man. The second officer, still avoiding eye contact, shifted his stance. "Mom, we were just doing our jobs," he stammered. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "No," she said simply. "You won't." Dawson inhaled sharply through his nose. But before he could try to defend himself, Richard's voice cut through again. "I want your badge numbers. Both of you." Evelyn watched as Dawson visibly hesitated. He didn't want to do it. He thought he could smooth this over, brush it off. But now the game had changed. Slowly, he pulled out his notepad, scribbled something down, and handed the piece of paper to Evelyn. The second officer followed suit. Though his hands shook slightly, Evelyn took the paper and folded it neatly, slipping it into her pocket without looking. Richard spoke again. "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs, and trust me, this will not be forgotten." For the first time since the whole thing started, there was silence. Neither officer had anything left to say. Evelyn inhaled deeply, then turned back to her car. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. She moved with the same grace and poise she'd always had, even though they tried to strip that from her. And they failed. She slid into her seat, shut the door, and rolled up the window. Dawson stepped back, as if he'd just realized she wasn't some fragile old woman. She was power. The second officer, still avoiding her gaze, shifted awkwardly as they both began to head back toward their cruiser. Evelyn placed both hands on the steering wheel. Steady and composed, she pulled away from the curb, her back straight and her chin high. Yet she knew this wasn't over. The real issue wasn't who her son was. It was that she'd had to make that call in the first place. The ride home was silent. But Evelyn's mind was anything but. She should have been thinking about dinner, or the book she'd been reading, or even whether she'd remembered to buy the right kind of tea. Instead, she replayed the last 30 minutes in her head. How quickly things escalated. How familiar it all felt. And how different it might have been if she were someone else. Her son's name had saved her. But what about those who didn't have that safety net? What about those who never made it home? She turned onto her street, slowing as she pulled into her driveway. The house she'd lived in for 20 years, the one she'd worked so hard for, looked the same as it always did. And yet it no longer felt the same. She parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, letting herself feel the frustration, the exhaustion, the disgust that even at 72 she still had to prove she belonged. Then she exhaled and opened the door. She wasn't about to let two men with badges steal any more from her than they already had. As she stepped inside, her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "You okay?" Evelyn stared at the screen for a second before typing back, "I will be." She set the phone down on the counter, shook off the weight of the day, and reached for the kettle. In her 72 years, she'd learned this. The world wasn't fair. Justice wasn't guaranteed, and dignity was something you had to fight to keep. But she wasn't going to stop fighting. Not today. Not ever. This happens too often to people who don't have the right connections, the right titles, the right names. Evelyn had a way out. But what if she didn't? How many stories have ended differently? How many voices have been silenced? It wasn't just about one bad stop. It was about a system that allowed it to keep happening. We can't look away. We can't stay silent. Because next time it could be someone you love.